Hi, everybody. I promised you that I would make a presentation about Sherlock Holmes, a little bit more talking about the transitions from the world that we're looking at when we're reading the Sherlock Holmes stories into the world that we get plunged into, drink in hand, with Nick and Nora Charles. And I'm also going to talk, you'll get another presentation which talks specifically about what's going on in the Thin Man. But I thought it would be good for us to look at how the Holmes stories are such a great bridge between what I can refer to as a 19th century world and a 20th century, almost modern world. So let's start out by looking at this in a certain way. I'm going to freeze the camera as always. So, you stole a line from Jimmy Buffett's song, changes in attitude, changes in latitude, to talk about how incredible an upheaval goes on between the time that Conan Doyle starts writing the Holmes novels or the Holmes stories and when he finishes in 1925. That was his last published one. I remember studying Scarlet as 1888, and it's right there, as I said in the previous presentation. He's right at this cultural moment where everything is about to change completely. There's a tremendous amount of social upheaval on every single front. I mentioned some of these briefly in last week's presentation, but I want to return to them. One of the things that happens is that as we move from the 19th century to the 20th century, there are all kinds of social and cultural forces and economic forces that are pushing the world, particularly the Western world, particularly America and Britain and Europe, into a completely uncharted territory. I had mentioned before the emergence of psychoanalysis, new ways of thinking about how people do think and what choices they make, what things are, what things do they do because they're born that way, and what things can people change. And this is something that has tremendous bearing on what's going on with Holmes and then with Charles. It's interesting. I'm sure that you probably noticed in the Thin Man, there's a lot of reference to the Oedipus complex and incest and what all. There's a tremendous interest in all those things by some of the characters, and they use the language of psychoanalysis very freely and very easily, although not always correctly, and we'll talk about that in the next presentation. But what's important here is that the way that people in these cultures think about themselves alters dramatically as a new language to talk about how people think and what people do, as that language emerges. And this language is replacing long-held beliefs about what human beings could do, what they couldn't do, and just a whole range of things. One thing that there's a huge discussion about emerging right in this bridge era is talking about human sexuality. First of all, the amazing thing is that it could be spoken about. Normally, the stage in which human sexuality was spoken about in the 19th century would be either in pornography or in terms of medicine. It was not something that women could talk about. It was not something, women were not recognized as sexually active, engaged, responsive people unless they happened to be prostitutes, and that was a different deal. But women in the middle and upper classes were not referred to or acknowledged as sexual beings. That just was not something that one did. Now, I just want to say as a side note, if you go back to the Middle Ages and to the Renaissance, what you will see is that is not the case there, and there's actually a tremendous acknowledgement of female sexuality. But we're really talking about the transition that we're making from the 19th century and how much these things have changed. We are working up to the First World War, but there's already a lot of social upheaval, and part of what's happening is that the model which is served in the 19th century and before that of imperialism. This is something that I've mentioned before, which is the idea that, well, our culture is better, so we have to go out and lay a little culture on them, as to paraphrase George Carlin. The point was that we had to take those poor, benighted, people of the darker races, or from different parts of the world. They really need what we've got in the West. They really need to get some religion and get all these get some culture and put on some clothes, and they need to figure it out. This model is crumbling as there begin to be the stirrings of nationhood in the colonized countries. And what we see is that really from after World War I through the 50s and 60s, we see all the pigeons coming home to roost, and we see the crumbling of imperialism. We see the crumbling of the British Empire, and so how people perceive themselves as governmentally, their place in the world is in the process of changing. It's in the process of tremendous alteration. There is a sense in the Holmes novels of, and this is something I referred to last week, of the struggle to suggest that we still can maintain control. Holmes is all about control because he always solves the mystery. There is an answer. And that's, I would like to suggest, what really, if you wanted to boil down all the alterations that we see in this incredibly vital, troubled, exciting, terrible time in history, they can all be brought down to changes in the sense of certainty. That's something that's tremendously under attack. One thing that I talked a little bit about psychoanalysis. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the idea of art. There's a famous quote from Virginia Woolf. She says, "On or about December 1910, human character changed." And what she was referring to was in December of 1910, there was an art exhibition that was featured a lot of modernist Cubist art. These are, if you think about Picasso, if you Google him, and you can see some of the work that he did. Think about how different this is from the art that precedes it, which is what we would call representational art, where we're seeing, pictures of women and men. We start seeing Impressionism, which is rendering scenes and bodies in different ways, but still has identifiable human beings and places and things like that. When you see Monet's water lilies, you know that those are still lilies. Well, what happens with art is that there's this wonderful and frightening, I'll say it again, explosion of all kinds of alternatives to art. What you have is the Young Turks coming up and saying, let's make it new. That's a quote from Ezra Pound. He said that's the whole point of poetry. So in writing, in poetry, in drama, in literature, in visual arts, all across the spectrum, you see this tremendous push of experimentalism, where people are willing to create things that are not beautiful, that are jarring, that are disturbing, that are difficult to comprehend. There's a changing sense of audience and what is the artist's duty to the audience. Now you see, Conan Doyle is firmly in the old school camp. He's really there. By the time we get to Dashiell Hammett, that's not the case. It becomes much more in flux and much more interesting. And we'll talk about that when we get to the presentation on The Thin Man. Another thing that we see during this bridge period between, let's say, the 1880s up into the 1930s is a huge change in technology. We start having the telephone, radio. We talked about telegrams, but the technology for doing that is vastly advanced. The cars become commonplace. We start to see the decline of the railway as a mode of travel. horses and buggies disappear. Think about how the world alters physically in terms of human beings' perception of what their physical world is when they're able suddenly to get out of the horse and buggy and get into the car and go 50 miles an hour down a road and be from here to there. The sphere and the scope of people's lives change because of that. And this is incredibly dislocating for people. Holmes lives in a world where patriarchal, meaning male-dominated, order still rules. It's still there. And he is sort of its foremost proponent in many ways because he is the answer giver, the answer finder, and he is able to reimpose order again and again. So anyway, thinking about these changes in technology, they're huge, and they're not just the technology, sort of like the not ambiguous, but the technology that doesn't really hurt you, but also the technology of war is vastly improved, if you want to put it that. I guess I don't. But one of the hugest events that has an impact on how people see their role or their place in the world during this bridge period is World War I. If you notice, I have a quote here that there's over 20 million military and civilian deaths. 20 million people died. Unbelievable number, and they died horribly. It was a horrifying war because it was fought in the trenches. It was a combination of old school and new school. In fact, you still had some people doing cavalry charges and, of course, being annihilated by machine guns and cannons. What happens in 1914 through 1918 is the first time that we have a world war. And here again, I'm saying, as the world contracts because we're able to get to more places, the people start battling for spheres of influence on a much larger level. Okay, this is World War I. For the people who survived it, for the soldiers who survived it, they would return home tremendously disillusioned, horrified, post-traumatic stress, you name it. Partially because World War I was a war where very little was actually gained. If you look at the history of it, there wasn't this clear objective or as much of an identifiable enemy or reason why people were reason why the troops felt that they had been sent into battle. One thing that's very interesting, if you look at World War I poets, many of them, it's the first time that you find people writing in protest. There's the quote about, it is good and beautiful to die for the sake of one's country. It's an old Roman quote, which people often said. It built upon the sort of 19th century sense of honor and duty and dignity. What do you do? What is your duty to the world? Well, World War I marks the first time that they used poison gas on a wide-scale level, and the deaths that people suffered from that are horrifying. If you ever are interested, I highly recommend the poet Wilfred Owen, a tremendous poet of the World War I era, and he talks very much about death and the waste and the loss of life. And so you have people really questioning, why are the old men sitting in the back sending me off to war? And yet I returned from war, with no legs and no arms, and what's going on here? That's a seismic shift in what, in the very organization of society, because you have people who feel empowered to ask those questions, to protest, to get upset, to try to create change, to see themselves as different from the older generation that goes before. Okay. Now, related to this, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit and then go back. But related to this is what happens with women during this time. Now, one thing I want to make sure that you guys catch with the Holmes thing is the women's roles in this, in the Holmes stories. In every case, the women are very, very traditional. They occupy traditional roles, or they are seen as aberrant, as they're, that there's something wrong with them somewhere along the line. But they're very traditional roles. They faint, they swoon, they need to be protected. They are innocents. They are abused. They are basically moved. They are pieces, pawns on a chessboard that get moved around by men. They are possessions. They are sacred objects. They are not out there solving the mysteries with Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes has Dr. Watson, not Mrs. Watson. And you think of one of the most primary and ongoing female characters is a housekeeper in the Holmes stories. So very much we see the old model of what womanhood is supposed to be and what women are supposed to do in this story. Some people were asking questions about, when did attitudes begin to change? And one of the things that changes is if you look in the if you're looking in the 1890s, you will see, you really see the women's suffrage movement. That means women agitating for the vote really take off. I mean, women in the streets with signs and, blowing things up and chaining themselves to gates. And it's actually, it's a tremendous thing. Now, this women's agitation for the right to vote goes much, much, much farther back into the early 1800s, and women are starting to write about this and about the idea early on. I can't overstate how, in general, women were viewed as being unnatural and mannish when they stood up and had something to say about whether they decided to write books or they decided to publish pamphlets or agitate for, as someone did, for birth control and for gynecological health, how much these women were made fun of, reviled, punished, threatened when they did this. Really, in the early to late 1800s, women were seen as, a woman who stepped out of line was really seen as an oddball. There was a model, and we start seeing this really in the mid 1800s, a creature referred to as the New Woman. And the New Woman was a woman who was sexually active, who chose a career over marriage, or who had multiple partners, who didn't have a man to devote herself to. And only way that these women were able to be portrayed was that they were portrayed as unhappy and miserable. And they would either die in the end, or commit suicide, or do some other horrible thing, or every now and then they would give in and get married. But there's a tremendous history of this kind of literature, and it's kind of a side note. But what we're seeing is this huge transition. If you look at pictures of Victorian women, of how women dress in the era, late 1800s, early 1900s, you see that they're padded and they're protected, and they've got hats and veils and all kinds of stuff. But once we cross into the 1920s, you start to see the emergence of the flapper. I'm sure you're familiar with that character. I mean, you can look that up. This is a woman who cuts her hair, wears a dress that exposes her legs, heaven forbid, and in general comes out as a sexual being. Nevertheless, I'm talking about all these changes, the tremendous sea change that occurs between Holmes and Charles. But I just want to ask you, I challenge you, I lay down the gauntlet, that you look around you today and see if those concepts of women who choose a career or who foreground their career, see if those concepts don't still exist. See if we don't see women who don't get married or don't have children in some sort of suspect light, that we wonder about those choices, and we are always, we might be concerned about them. I'm not saying this is true across the board. I'm just saying that there's a lot of that cultural imperative of how women should look and what women do, and how men should look and what men should do, remain in our cultural psyche. They're still there. We still have those ideas. It's just that they've been altered and sanded down a little bit, but they're still there. Things don't just disappear from culture, and I think that that's one of the reasons why I keep making connections between each of the works that we do and saying, oh, look how everything's changed, but instead saying, look how things have evolved, look how things have developed. Okay, a couple of other alterations I think it's worth noticing. One is people's attitude towards religion. There's definitely a much stronger current of atheism. People who had been through World War I or had been involved with it, many people really felt that they lost faith through that. It was a very difficult time. Other types of religions are also becoming of interest to certain people. One thing that has remained the same is that Jews are still seen as suspect and sinister. You will have noticed that shows up not just in the Holmes novel, but also in the Charles novel. There's the mention of the Jew. Okay, I talked a little bit about flappers and traditional roles. I want to back up and look at the idea of communications. That the changes in how communications are accomplished make a big difference. There's a lot more that can be known, not just by deduction. Not by, well, I figured out, sort of in a kind of a magic trick that such a, so-and-so communicated with so-and-so. But the options of how people communicate with each other have expanded tremendously as we go through this bridge period. We see the introduction of the typewriter, or how the typewriter plays a key role in the Thin Man. But also we think about the fact that now the forms of communication like telegrams and telegraph and even the phone become things that even common people can use. It doesn't cost so much that people can't do it. The idea that we can communicate at long distances, that we can find things out, I had mentioned in the last time, starts to emerge with Holmes, that the science and the practice of deduction is altering as technology alters. Be aware of that incredible relationship between us. We talked about drug abuse last time. Sherlock Holmes is portrayed as being kind of an oddball. The addictions to morphine and to cocaine were really quite common among artists and writers in the the early to mid-late 18th century. You found many women would be addicted to this too. Laudanum is another opiate that people would take. It wasn't, but we see that the drug addiction is part of what moves Sherlock Holmes outside the norm. By the time we get to the Thin Man, we see this whole class of people for whom the norm is drinking. You live the high life. That's what you do. That's what elegant people do. It's let's have cocktails. Let's have I'm waking up. Let's have a drink. There isn't a sense that this drug addiction is abnormal in any way, even though in the 1920s prohibition happens. This is it, and this has a huge effect. And it's sort of like now it becomes in to flout the what's supposedly the law of the land. Okay, that's in the United States that prohibition happens. When I talk about violence and being one of the alterations, I'm really looking back at what happens in World War I. It's the ability to have violence on a large scale. And I think that the murder and mayhem go from being the purview of the odd and the eerie and the frightening to being just another thing that people do. This is what people do. They murder each other. Now, I want to be very, very, very clear with you. There was a tremendous amount of crime in Victorian England. Tremendous. There were gangs, and there were pimps and prostitutes and gamblers and all types of things. The point is that the ability to regulate those things was much, much less. It was just, and the knowledge of it was much less. It was perfectly possible that you could kill somebody and get away with it. This is again this change in communications. Much less could be known. But I don't. One of the things I strongly try to help people get away from is the idea that somehow, if you go back into the 1800s, those were the good old days and everybody was great. It was not the good old days. I mean, one thing I haven't mentioned in terms of technological advances was the change in health care, the ability to identify and treat a whole range of diseases. People died left and right in the 1800s, 1700s from consumption, from a whole number of what now are completely curable diseases like, common cold could carry somebody away. We have changes in sanitation that make things different, but please don't get a pretty happy view of the 1800s as well, those were the good times. But those things are all changing. Another thing that we see altering between Holmes and Charles is the evolving role of law enforcement. It's really in the 1900s and beyond that we see, both in the United States and in Britain, the real emergence of a bona fide police force. We're going to next read, after Farewell, My Lovely, we're going to be looking at Death of an Expert Witness. But even in Farewell, My Lovely, we're going to be seeing a police force that's no longer seen as a bunch of semi-comic bumblers, but as people who truly have a practice and also a great deal of corruption. And it's going to be it's a really interesting thing. But as the police themselves, the public representatives of law enforcement, develop a strong practice that they, a way that they go about solving crimes, a methodology, a reach into the world of crime. We see the private detective, we see his or her role altered and diminished, because what they're doing now is they're sort of serving on the periphery of crime. But this is something that's really changing during the time. The importance and identification of social class is another thing that's really altering. If you lose your faith in the world as it is after a cataclysm like World War I, one of the things you do learn, you lose faith in, is the idea that social class is something inbred, and that the people at the top of the heap are somehow better and more worthy than those at the bottom of the heap. However, but when we get to Charles, to Nick and Nora Charles, there's still a real sense of social class, but it's brought about by by money, the fact that they have money and the social circles that they move in. It's not so much how they're born. Remember that Nick is the son of an immigrant, and he definitely had to work for his living until he married Nora, and apparently he still does a little bit of work on the side to make sure he's managing her stuff. Okay. The next thing that we see, and I'm sorry, I want to just go back and say, with Sherlock Holmes, social class is still very, very important. It's the idea of having an education, of sort of speaking the special language. You'll notice that the differentiation between the people who serve Holmes and his friend, or Holmes and Watson, and those two characters is very strong. Conan Doyle does a great job really identifying who's who by words they use, by where they live, what's going on. We're going to see that begin to alter. It's not going to go away, but it's going to alter, because how we identify class is going to be linked to other things besides birth. When I was talking about the first two detectives, I used the word they were well born, and that idea is going to change quite a bit, particularly in the American novels. Okay. We talked about imperialism and how that is altering. Even in the 1880s, we're starting to see the disintegration of that. We mentioned Prohibition. The other thing that we didn't mention, or that I haven't mentioned so far, is the Great Depression. And this has another tremendous impact on how people see themselves and what seems to be important. The Depression creates this sense of incredible dislocation. People lose money. People aren't able to take care of themselves or their families, and their sense of themselves as a national or as a nation, if you look at America, again, alters from going, we're all powerful, we've got all this great stuff going on. We move over into what's next, what's going to happen, is the end of the world upon us. I want to wrap this up by saying, again, look at the change between Sherlock Holmes and Nick Charles. What you see is the loss of certainty. Look how many times Nick Charles says, I don't know, or it might be, or probably. And then go back and look at Holmes and how Holmes answers questions when he's asked. The sense that there is an overriding answer, that justice can be served, that things can be all wrapped up neatly, that sense disappears. It disappears in the smoke and the horror and the death of World War I. It disappears in the 1920s with all the changes in women's status and in men's status. It disappears in the Great Depression and all the upheavals that causes as well.